Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, so glad to be here. Oh wait, so glad to be here with you all. Sorry I couldn't join you earlier. I'm sorry I've been in back to back, but I was glad to catch Juliana's hers talk a little most of it, and it's actually a nice segue in many ways. And so I want to say hello. What time is it? I always have to remember what time it is. Um, I will not turn on my subtitle. Do people need subtitles? No, right? I assume not. Okay. So I'll just spend, 15, 20 minutes, just I think taking a lot of what Juliana was saying and really sort of, I'm going to kind of go a little bit, talk a little bit more on the higher level, and I won't get into too much data. But I'm Iheoma Iruka from UNC Chapel Hill, and I want to sort of give you my take-home message for what I'm gonna. The couple of words I'm gonna say is, and before I do that, I want to first thank Stephanie and thank Angela for this meeting. I think it's so good to create a space, even if you can't see each other in person. And I think it's so important to also include those who are Montessorians, those who do Montessori research, and those who do not, because I think the more we can kind of interconnect our work, the richer our work could be, but also the better our programming and policies can be to create much more of this equitable space and equitable learning environment for our diverse children. So I want to say thank you all really for creating this space. And so my take home message to you all, in case you have to go answer your phone, check on your kids, do some, is that I want to remind us, right, that your work, our work, and words have power, and that they must be used well. And when we think about it, you can't just do anti-racism work. I think, that's like the word that people have now. I think hopefully there's more people using that word and doing the work, but we have to live it. And so I'll talk a little bit about the richer framework. And I also want to just emphasize that, for this work around anti-racism, racial equity, there's different words you can use, but we are on a journey. And so I would say that part of what I hope to do is to continue to employ you to read, to engage, but really to lean in. And I'm hoping that, even though there's a lot of people suffering and there's a lot happening in our country on so many levels, that we can't continue to do the same thing and hope for something better to happen. And so I think to Juliana's sort of the road, I'm hoping that we take a road that's different, that will get us in a space of much more equitable practices, policies, research, and not continue to take that same road and hope it's going to change, because that's called insanity, right? Insanity is when you keep doing the same thing over and over again and assume it's going to change. It's not. That's insane. So I hope that we go on that road of continue to undo racism in many, many ways. And so I kind of start with, to remind us, right, this is the Montessori research sort of conference, that what is the purpose of research, right? What is the value of it? And I would remind us that, for most of the US history, Black and brown bodies and labor, intellect, all that have been used to advance science and capitalism, really, but usually not for the benefit of the most marginalized, right? So whether we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study, where we talk about the Jewish hospital cancer cells, Willowbrook, there's a lot of studies, and a lot of them have really been on the backs of particularly marginalized communities. And early childhood, including early childhood intervention, has been part of that, where a lot of the work that we know and use has been done primarily, at least in more contemporary times, 50 plus or so, has been done really mostly on poor Black children, families. And so, when we think about intervention, early childhood really has been because Black people in particular have said, sure, we'll be in your intervention. And we see that with other things, like we know, a lot of our gynecological instruments were based on Black women, enslaved women, to be completely transparent, issues around breast milk versus formula. So a lot of the signs that we have done in many ways that has moved us forward to be this great nation, to be this progressive, intellectually intelligent nation, has been done both on the bodies and labor of Black people, but also on the intellect of Black people. So I want to make sure, and other people of color as well. So I think we want to remember that as we sort of continue our work, but also think about how we do our work. And I want to sort of, I know this is one of my favorite examples to use when I talk about the power of research. And I think as you sort of continue with the conference, to think about what is the power of research and in its value to society, right? And so I always think about sort of the Moynihan report. And for those who don't know Moynihan, right? He was the Secretary of Labor, right? He has a report, right? And it's called the Moynihan Report, the Negro Family, the Case for National Action. Um, and it's important to sort of know this report, not in all the details, but in the way that, his team used national data to articulate, why do we have this issue with the Negro family, right? It sort of talked about the pathologies of Black families. It talked about that the reason why Black males are not in the home is because of Black women, and sort of really place the blame in many ways of sort of the issues with the Black community squarely on the shoulders of Black people, and did not fully explain and articulate that there are some fundamental issues in the US, like Jim Crow, like the historical legacy of racism, like all of that stuff kind of was kind of barely touched on. And so, but this report in many ways, it has set a lot of the agenda we see today, such as imprisonment of primarily Black men, right? 1 out of 3 Black men is likely to be imprisoned a lifetime, right? They make up almost, in some states, over 50% of the population. This is not by chance, right? That 1 out of 3 Black males, 1 out of 18 Black women, and the numbers are not that much better for Latino men and Latino women, but better than Black people. But, right, and a lot of that goes on the idea that if you think that certain groups of people are pathological, then your policies are going to, in essence, create that self-fulfilling prophecy. And that large research that they use to create policies, we can see to today. But what I think is important for us to recognize is that while the Moynihan Report said this publicly, and people still champion it across, you can still probably read about it and the commentary about how great it was from some of our scholars in the field still. There was a counter narrative, right? Again, looking at the same data, right, with Robert Hill, right? He talked about the idea that if you look at the data in a very clear, culturally grounded way, you will see that the data is telling us so many things about the strengths of Black families, from the strong kinship bond, from the strong work orientation, the religious orientation, the adaptability of the family roles, to the high achievement orientation, right? The fact that, don't forget, Black people were not even allowed to be schooled and educated, but they still were like, we're going to make sure our children get educated. Imagine if this was the narrative that was used to create policies versus one that says, oh, Black women are having babies out of wedlock because they don't know any better. And so that's leading to Black males being out of home and creating troubles, et cetera. Right? Imagine what that would mean if this was the narrative. And so that's when I talk about the power of research and the power of how you interpret the research, it could have lifelong consequences. And I think that is what we have to continue to understand and continue to do. So as you sort of, I think, continue with the conference, today and tomorrow, it's to really, I think, leaning into the notion of that all of our research, small, big, large, however, that when they're used, they could be used for good, but they could also be used for what I would consider lethal intergenerational effects, right? So how can research, practice, policy promote, minoritized children's optimal development in a way that's asset-based? I think really, as Juliana was talking about, right? And I think that means that we have to look at not just what's happening in the home, in the household, those are really important, but also to recognize what's happening in sort of the political context that impact children, right? Think about children today, what they're going to need and what they're dealing with today. Like COVID-19 was not there during my life when I was right 3 and 4 and 7, like my kids, right? But so their lives are going to be different. We have to understand those contexts. But some things like racism, they look different, but they're still permeating their lived experiences no matter what. But however, how can we, though, regardless, promote much more of this tighter connection between research, practice, and policy? And I think that's really important, right? Because as researchers, we can do our own thing, be smart, be brilliant in our labs, I do that, However, though, for us to really activate change, right, to ensure that children are able to get what they need, we actually have to begin to think much more thoughtfully about how do we connect it in practice and policy. And I think, with the work that Juliana is doing, it shows how we can actually create much more of this alignment and synergy to really meet the needs of children in a way that's going to be more accelerated, which we're going to need today. So, for example, I think about the work around, anti-poverty, right? If you think about it, there's at least 60 plus years of work around anti-poverty, right? That's why we have things like SNAP, we have earned income tax credit, we have the National School Lunch Program, we have Medicaid, and now more discussion about Medicaid expansion. We have all of these policies. I remember all those policies were actually based on research, right? That was accumulated, and they continue to obviously update, revise policies again based on research that's coming, coming. And so I wonder, could we create a similar sort of approach to think about how do we create sort of a whole energy and synergy around racial equity, but anti-racist studies and research, the same way we've created all these anti-poverty research that has created policies that now really impacts children and families' lives. And we can see that, with children who can, access healthcare, they can access, their families can access WIC and TANF, et cetera. So for me, I feel like one of the things that we can continue to do is how do we engage in a way that says most of our research should really continue to target practice, but obviously as well as policy, both policy on a local level, but also policy on the national level whenever that's possible. But to do that, I think what we have to continue to do is think through, what impacts children, right? As I said earlier, right, the idea of, I borrow this heavily from public health. They talk a lot about structural determinants of health. And for us to understand any issues around diversity, around equity, around disparities, right, we have to understand that there are micro issues, right, whether it's the family, whether the school, where the opportunities, there's other psychological, social, psychosocial factors, but there's also these other positioning that places you in particular either risk or advantage, right, whether you're a person of color, whether you come from a higher income, high wealth home, whether, what kind of work your parents do, where you live, right? So there's these other things that position you. But a lot of that is actually set in many ways because of the policies that exist. So, for example, a teacher. Who is a teacher, right? Based on certain policies, a teacher is somebody who has made it through BA degree and now has gotten credentials through their state system, and then they become a teacher and get all these other access to other things. Whereas if you're sort of a childcare quote unquote provider, you're not considered a teacher. You don't get access to all these other benefits, higher paying, jobs, et cetera. You don't get sort of retirement benefits like those in the school systems, right? So those kind of policies position a particular person a particular way, and that potentially has impact on children that they teach, but also on their own children and families, and subsequently the learning disparities. So we have to begin to sort of think both and think about what's happening in the home and the school, but also think about what are the policies that are driving things in a way. And I think the more we can kind of lean into much more of these macroeconomic sort of research, coupled with these micro research about what's happening in the schools, what's happening in classrooms, how can we support the workforce and teachers, then yes, we can continue to do sort of better work in many ways. And I would say, in this space, that now that there's much more, I would say, acknowledgement of the pernicious nature of racism and how it has cut across in so many levels, right? That we now even have, banks like Citigroup talking about racism has cost the country $16 trillion over the past 20 years, right? Like, yes, let's talk about the monetization of it, but that also means that has cost a lot of families a lot of wealth, but also a lot of health, and also children, their learning and their positioning and and their health in many ways. So I think the more we can think about anti-racist research, I think the better off we will be, and our children, particularly children of color, will be hopefully 20, 30, 40 years from now. And and in my I'll just move on. I was going to talk about this, but I'll just move on to this. The one thing I did not say is that so I am part of the Brady Education Foundation. I'm a board member, and and I would say that this is an example of how do we sort of engage in anti-racist research action partnerships. And so, and Brady also, I think, is a supporter of this conference. And I just want to kind of highlight sort of how do we go about anti-racist research action partnerships. And so the Brady Education Foundation Montessori Initiative Network was established, and the goal was really to conduct a large and rigorous multi-site study to investigate the impact of really Montessori education in the sort of the primary part of it, the 3s to 5, in the public sector, to see how does Montessori in the public sector impact children's academic achievement, executive function, et cetera. And really, we wanted to find out if the approach is equally effective, right, for minoritized children compared to white children. And so we're trying to say, does Montessori actually reduce the achievement gap on many levels? And I think that was an important question to ask. And I want to sort of talk about the challenges. And I want to talk a little bit also about this whole anti-racist kind of action, right? So the study had a big criteria. The criteria was stringent. It was like, you have to be implementing a solid Montessori program, right? You had to be in the public sector, tuition free for families, either in a district charter or whatever. You had to begin at age 3, and children had to be admitted through lottery, which is how you get your RCT. And so we had this sort of, which I think was a strong design. But unfortunately, we realized that many public school sector schools did not have a lottery, did not actually use a lottery because they had all these preferences, like if you're a sibling in a neighborhood, et cetera. And we needed a large sample size for each of the racial groups who were focused on, which was really, Latin group and then the Black group. And because also our groups tend to think about attrition and mobility. What we came to find out is that there was an oversubscription in majority white schools and communities, and an undersubscription in Black majority schools, right? So basically, you could be a Montessori, you met all the criteria, but what we found is in many of our Black majority Montessori schools, they were undersubscribed, which means we really couldn't, there was no need for lottery, right? You couldn't really do an RCT. And then at the same time, with the Latin communities, we found that the issue of immigration was also present, minimizing our ability to recruit. And of course, this made us have to sort of do a pivot. And I think it's important to kind of recognize the pivot, right? The pivot, because we recognize that the issues of structural racism literally was inherently there, both historical, which is why we had a lot of the Black majority Montessori schools that we couldn't really use them because they were undersubscribed, right? Because of the historical legacy of how people view Blackness and all that. And then obviously the contemporary issues of racism with the xenophobia and obviously the current occupier of the White House, right? That created this toxicity where we couldn't actually engage with our Latin communities. And so, we had to do a pivot, right? To still be able to unpack whether Montessori as an educational, quote, if I could say intervention, but as an education approach, whether it still is particularly beneficial for children from minoritized communities. And so, we said we're going to do a policy landscape to assess equitable access, do a sort of a quasi-experimental study, use administrative data, continue to engage in the work that Angela's doing around her observational tool, and of course, this research retreat that we helped to sponsor. And I think as we sort of even started this work, I would say that part of what we wanted to also do is not just do the science. And I think that's important, that while we focus on how do we make sure that our research is anti-racist and less biased, I think what we wanted to also do through this mechanism was how do we create a network of researchers to do research differently, right? That means that you can't just talk about the science without talking about who is doing the science and how the science is being conducted. And so for my last sort of set of words, I sort of introduce you to sort of this richer framework that I think really connects with where the board, in particular, the British Education Foundation Board, I would say, again, from my perspective. So one is this idea of, for us to do anti-racism in any ways, we actually have to re-educate ourselves about the history of the US, right? For the most part, it's either been whitewashed, we didn't get the full lesson, during social studies and history, right? That means that we had to go through and really understand some aspects of the legacy of racism and how it sort of permeates science generation. That means that that each of us in our own way as board members had to really go and really interrogate our knowledge and really continue to learn about the legacy of racism and how it permeates. And then our other part that we wanted to also do in doing the science that we were trying to do with the Montessori initiative was to really integrate the research network and really integrate the research teams. That meant that for the RFP, right, the request for proposals, that we wanted multiracial teams with people of color as part of the leadership, right? We didn't want your Black and Latin people to be your research assistants only. We wanted to be part of the PI leadership. And that's something that was intentional, right? Because we have a lot of studies with people of color, but they happen to be the ones without power. And also in terms of the richer framework, it's about, you have to critique everything, right? We can't assume that, oh, the measure is valid and reliable. No, we have to question, who was it reliable for? What was the theory that developed it? So we had to critique as much as we could in the time frame and the budget we had, sampling, measures, why the recruitment challenges. We had to really go through and begin to unpack, right? Every time you unpack one thing, another thing pops up, because you continue to realize how much the issues of racism permeates so many things that we do in the science world. And of course, have humility of privilege, right? Here we were, a foundation, we're funding work, right? So we have to be aware of our power, which also meant that we have to make sure that we diffuse our power, at least try to make sure that we had an advisory group that was multiracial that could be a support to the work. And so it means that when you're a funder, you have to be careful that you're not abusing your power to sort of create dynamics and or just say do what I tell you, as opposed to you are a researcher and an expert. Let's make sure that we utilize your expertise. And then of course, I think still go on erasing racism, right? Erase all the racism, ableism, all the isms, which is really important for the conduction of science. And so I would say for part of the board is to, we had to resolve some of our research guides and policies. We have to still think about how is a foundation engaging in research as anti-racist? How is our RFPs too long? Do they not ask the right questions? Right? How do we make sure that we're not sort of continue to sort of take that road of let's do the same thing the same way and hope for something different? And so I think that's work that's still ongoing. And of course, I think it's to re-envision new ways to both do research, but also fund research or policies or programming, and not feel like we have to just do things one way. So I would say when I think about the richer framework, which is to re-educate about our history, all of us should do that. We have to continue to think about how do we integrate not just our work, but also how we do our work, who we do our work with, and then continue to critique everything, right? Even our analyses, actually, the way we do analyses has a level of inherent racism in it. But also have a level of humility in our privilege as researchers or leaders in the field. Is how do we make sure that we honor that level of privilege that we have, and ensure that we are not positioning us as researchers are the best, and those who actually are doing the hardest work are also just as brilliant researchers. And also to really focus on erasing all of the isms, particularly racism and all its toxicity, and then really can you really envision how do you do work a different way, a better way, a more equitable way with different teams think about different theories, right? Do we ever cite theorists that are Black or brown, right? Think about all the things that we do, and re-envision how we do our work. And so I just want to remind us that your work and your words and my work, your work, our work has power, and so do our words. They also have power. So I leave you with sort of my take home message about, knowing your power, to live in the richer framework, and to continue on the journey. And I think as you sort of continue with the conference, is to remember that, I always take these words from Malcolm X, right? That speaking like this around anti-racism or racism writ large, it's not that we're anti-white, right? But it does mean that we're anti-exploitation, anti-degradation, and anti-oppression. And so I think it's for us to continue to lean in the research that's going to get us to the best future that we can possibly have. So with that, I say thank you, Angela, thank you, Stephanie. I am appreciative of this invitation.